Well, it's been sometimes said when we gather together that we have to be divine scientists, in fact divine physicists. And we know what physicists do. They make equations and you see them up on the board, and sometimes they cover the whole board, this plus this, that plus this plus this equals, or you have that simple one, E equals mc squared. But in the telling of several stories, old stories, there is the need to make an equation and see if we can work out what the symbols of these stories equal for us. The first is the story of a young Western man who was seeking enlightenment, and being dissatisfied with the methods that were available in the West, he decided to travel to Japan, where he knew there were Zen temples and teachings. So he found himself at a Zen monastery, and he presented himself and asked could he be given entry to become a student of Zen meditation. And the Zen abbot said to him, "Well, we've heard about you Western young people. You find it very hard to follow rules, you're individualistic and you're rebellious. But we're very strict here. We have very strict rules and they have to be adhered to. Do you think that you can follow these?" And the young man, with great aplomb, said, yes, I'll do whatever it is that's told for me to do." So the abbot gave him the list of rules. You have to be up at 4 a.m. in the morning and in the meditation hall to meditate. You have to do your duty in the garden. You have to light the incense at 6 a.m. You have to stir the rice when it's your turn to do so, and so forth. So the young Western man came in, and he very avidly did what it was that was set out for him according to the rules. And when it was his turn to be in the kitchen stirring the rice, he was there on time stirring the rice. But then he noticed that the other acolytes, they didn't follow the rules at all. 4 o'clock in the morning they were still sleeping in, and when it was their turn to stir the rice or sweep the floor, they were not there on time, or they didn't even turn up. So he got very angry about that. He said, I'll show them. So he doubled his efforts in being in the meditation hall at 4 o'clock in the morning and stirring the rice when it was his turn, in the garden, reading when it was time for him to do so. And one day the old abbot came past, and he said to the young man, he said, you seem to be quite troubled. What is it that's troubling you? And the young man said, well, when I came here you told me that you had strict rules and nobody seems to be taking notice of them, and I'm showing that a Westerner can do what it is that's set out in the rules to do. And the abbot said, well, really what you're demonstrating is living and working in a state of frustration and anger, and that's no example at all. Oh, the young man was very chastened and very humbled by this, and so he said, well, how should it be then? And the abbot said, when the Buddha takes the Buddha broom and sweeps the Buddha floor and lights the Buddha incense and stirs the Buddha rice, then and only then will you be an example to all. And the second story is about that seeker after enlightenment who'd gone into the monastery at a very, very early age, and he'd studied and followed the practices assiduously. He did everything that was there to do. On the festival times he was there preparing the meditation hall. When there was a week of austerity, he fasted. He did all this, went on for years and years and years, but still he hadn't attained his goal of enlightenment. So he was downhearted. he got depressed. And the abbot noticed his dejected state and asked him what it was. And the acolyte said, I've been in this monastery for decades, seeking enlightenment, and still I have not achieved my goal. And the abbot said, well, you know, next week is our very strict week of fasting and following those rituals for this certain festival. And my suggestion is to you that you give this week your all. And if you're not enlightened at the end of that, you better kill yourself. So this acolyte decided that he would give it his all. So he was there, he fasted, he prayed, he meditated, he did all that there was, and more than 100% of what was required of one during that that week of a very strict adherence. And at the end of the week, he still hadn't become enlightened. So with very great resolve, he went up the stairs of the monastery, which had a tall, like minaret at the top, and he went right up to the top of the stairs, and he, with great certainty and resolve, he went over to the edge of the wall and put his leg over. And just in that moment it happened. Enlightenment descended. So he went racing down the stairs to the abbot. And the abbot, as soon as he walked in the door, just nodded and smiled and said, oh yes, okay, you finally surrendered and you've gone through the gateless gate. Now get out. And the last story is a story about a king who used to go in disguise out into his kingdom to see how his people were faring from time to time. And one very balmy evening, the king went out in his peasant's garb and was walking the streets of the town, when in the distance he saw the faint light of a candle in a window. But something about this little hovel, this little humble house, drew him, and he went down the street until he arrived. And when he looked in the window, there was a very poor man and his wife sitting over the table with their candle burning, and the man was intoning, chanting words. And there was an aura of peace and tranquility and even happiness about this simple abode. So the king was piqued by this, and so he knocked on the door, and when the door was answered by the poor man, who inquired of who he was, the king said, oh, I'm just a traveller on the road, and I wonder if you could offer me hospitality. Well, of course, the poor man offered the king the simple repast that they were eating and drinking, and he continued with his chanting and his intonations. And then the king in disguise asked the man, what is it you do for a living? How do you manage to put food on your table? And the poor man said, oh, I'm a cobbler, and I mend shoes in the town, and that's how I make enough to feed my wife and I. Oh, said the king, but I notice that you don't have any children. What's going to happen to you when you get old and you're not able to mend shoes any more? And the poor man said, oh, I have faith. Well, the king again was piqued by this, and he took his leave of the poor man and his wife, and he said, can I come again? And the poor man said, of course, you're welcome in my house at any time. So the king went off, but he couldn't help but wonder what it was that this poor man was talking about. He decided that he would test him. So the very next day he ordered his town criers to go out in the streets and announce that no one was allowed to mend shoes in the town anymore. So when the cobbler went out to ply his trade, he learned that there was no way that he could any longer earn a living. But he noticed a man carrying water. So he thought to himself, oh, one door closes and another opens, I'll become a water carrier. So in between times, the king in disguise, wondering how the poor man was going, again came to his house, and after they'd had a simple glass of wine, the king asked the poor man, well, what's happened to you now that the king has made that ruling that you're not allowed to mend shoes? Oh, said the poor man, I've now become a water carrier, and so I still can earn enough to feed my wife and myself. So the king went off because he still did not get his answer about what this poor man was about, and so the next day he sent out criers to say that no one was allowed to carry water in the streets of the town anymore. So when the man went out to carry water from the well to the people of the town, he learned that this livelihood was taken away from him. And so it so happened that he saw some wood choppers going with their axes out to go to the forest, and he thought, well, again one door closes and another one opens, so he got an axe and he went off to become a wood chopper. So when the king came again to visit, of course, the same thing happened. What has happened to you since the king made that edict that you couldn't carry water? And he said, oh, and now I've become a wood chopper. So the next day the king sent out his messengers to round up all wood choppers. They were to be given soldiers' uniforms and a sword, and they were to become guards around his palace. Well, of course, amongst those wood choppers was the old poor man, and he was taken off to the palace with his new uniform and his shining sword. But as it happened, he learned that soldiers were only paid once a month, and he had not a penny to buy food for himself and his wife. But he suddenly realized he had this bright, shining sword. So, being quite an adept, he whittled himself a wooden sword, which he put in the hilt that was part of the soldier's uniform, and he took out the sword and he sold it. And he had enough money to buy food for his wife and himself for the month before he got his soldier's pay. So the king came back to the poor man's house and asked him how was he faring now. And the poor man said, well, and told him the story of what had happened. And the king said, well, what about if he finds out about what you've done? The poor man said, but I have faith. I don't worry about things that have not yet happened. So the king went off, and he ordered that all of the town must gather around in the town square, because a thief was to be beheaded. He had stolen a melon from the king's orchards, and he was to have his head lopped. But as everyone was standing around with the poor man in his soldier's uniform. So the king directed that the poor man was to be brought up to be the executioner. He was the one who had to lop the thief's head. Well, the poor man begged. He said, "Please, I've never killed even so much as an ant in my whole life. I cannot do this." But the soldiers who came to take him up to the dais said, "No, well, if you don't do as you're told by the king, your own head is going to be lopped." So the poor man had to go up to the executioner's dais, and he said, "Well, please, before I perform this act, can I say a prayer?" So he put his head down in silent prayer, and then out aloud, so all the crowd could hear, he said, Lord, you know that I'm a poor man, but you know that I have never killed anything in my life before, and please, I beseech you, if this man is to die, please let my sword be swift and sharp, but if he is innocent, may my sword turn to wood. And when he took out his sword and raised it above his head, the crowd cheered, because here was the wooden sword. The king said to the poor man, "Who am I?" And the poor man looked, and he said, "Oh, why, you're the man who's been visiting me for the last 4 times. "Yes," said the king, "and I found you to be a wise man of great faith. I want you to come and be my advisor in my palace." And that's what his future held. Now if we look at these 3 stories as a physicist, and we make an equation out of them, what is the first story representing, not maybe as a symbol as a physicist would do, but as a word? What arose out of this first story? That bravado, that ego, that turned around. Humility. Could it be humility? And what about the second story? Dedication, tenacity, adherence. And in the end, the means to the end was what? Surrender. And the third story. Faith. So if we make an equation out of these 3, humility, surrender, and trust or faith, what in your experience would be the equals? What is the equation that's created by these 3? We know them all. We've experienced them all. Humility, our head on the ground. Surrender, we know well, on many levels. And faith also, otherwise we wouldn't have arrived here. What do they equal for us?
Freedom.
All right, freedom. Do you have another word for it?
Enlightenment.
Enlightenment, yes, certainly. What else is in your life now?
Where comes awareness.
Awareness, yes. Awakeness, could it be? They go together, don't they? Awakeness, presence, attention. Haven't these arrived after putting the other three together? Humility, surrender, and trust. Thank you, thank you.